Dr. Mehmet Çiftçi. I'm in charge of the library and the archive here at Pusey House, and I'm also involved with organizing the academic program here as well. You may know that this year and last year we have been celebrating the 140th anniversary of the founding of Pusey House in 1884, and so it is very fitting that we should pay homage to those who are responsible for this very building that we find ourselves in today. A building which has spoken of God through stone and through glass for generations of people who have passed through here. And I do not think we could have found a better speaker to speak on that subject today. Mr. Harry Spain, I'm very happy to introduce, is someone that many of you may know already because he was the former sacristan of the house. He is an architectural historian. He is currently writing a book about the Victorian church architect Benjamin Ferry. He has written on Temple Moore, the original architect of Pusey House, but he's here to speak to us today about Ninian Comper. So, Harry Spain, you're very welcome. Please join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Mehmet, for that very kind introduction. I will begin rather shamelessly with a personal plug, to say that you're all here presumably because you've got some interest in Comper, and there was a conference which I helped organize with David Lewis, who's a member of the congregation here and a colleague of mine last year, and we're hoping in due course to publish some of those essays in book form. So, before I start, I would say that at the end, if you're interested, come and approach me or David. David's there in a blue polo shirt, and we can add you to a mailing list and keep you up to date with that. So now that that's out of the way, I think we should begin at the end in about 1939, just as Comper's work in this chapel was reaching its conclusion. John Betjeman, who, of course, was an alumnus of this house, had befriended the aging architect a few years earlier, and he decided, in an attempt to try and reinvigorate Comper's career and reputation, that he'd publish a short biography of Comper in the rather trendy Architectural Review. In it, Betjeman began by writing that no English architect is better known in Cathedral Close and distant rectory than J.N. Comper. Now, it's a curious question, I think, as to whether we could still say that today, and I think actually you probably could. There's undoubtedly a renewed interest in Comper, in a large way thanks to the work of the late Father Anthony Simonson, who published the biography of Comper. And indeed, Comper does still hold a special place in the pantheon of English, or rather British, I should say, church architects, and especially amongst clerical circles in this country. Now, the reason why, I think, is fairly simple, and it's because Comper, I would contend at least, more than any other architect before or since, truly asked the question of what is the purpose and nature of religious art and architecture. Consequently, I think he was able to create churches that truly and authentically expressed a sense of the divine. Now, conscious as I am of time constraints, and I might actually just take off my watch so I can see how many minutes I've got left, I will only seek to give a short biographical note on Comper, which I will do, hopefully, with almost sole reference to Oxford, since it was this city that actually formed Comper as an architect in quite a significant way, despite actually having been born and brought up in Aberdeen. So, Comper's father, who we see here on the left, in a drawing by Comper, was the Reverend John Comper, who was that rare thing, an Anglo-Catholic in Scotland. He'd fallen under the spell of the Tractarians as a young man and had moved north of the border from Sussex to try and help bring the Oxford movement to the Scots. Actually, I think he's now been declared as a hero of the faith in the Scottish Episcopal Church, which I'm told is the closest you can get to being a saint in that particular church. We see here, as I say, a drawing of John Comper, his father, by his son, Ninian, and then on the right is Comper's first design for a church. That's St. Margaret's in Aberdeen, where John was the incumbent. This ultimately, sadly, wasn't built. But crucially for us, Comper's father, being an impoverished parish priest, sent his 10-year-old son to Oxford during the vacations from school since he couldn't afford to keep him at home. In Oxford, the young Comper was sent to live with the Cowley Fathers at their mission house, where he was taken on by Father George Congreve. And I must say at this point that practically all we know about Comper and Congreve is thanks to the research and scholarship of Father Luke Miller, whose biography of Congreve is well worth searching out if you want to read more. There's far more to say than I can include in this short section. But I will say that Comper, as soon as he arrived in the mission house, was set to work on some fairly trivial jobs, sort of holding open doors and things like that. And Congreve actually noted down his first impressions of the young boy. He said he was very well behaved and obliging and spent almost all of his time reading. Within about 10 days of Comper actually arriving for his first day at the mission house, Congreve took him out to Dorchester Abbey, where they looked at recently restored Lady Chapel there. And then on the way back home, they called in at North Morton, which had just been restored by Street. And the incumbent there also treated them to a little show of vestments in the rectory. So Comper kept on returning to Cowley each summer, and it was 6 years later, in 1880, that Congreve inadvertently set him off on his path to an architectural career, or rather vocation, by taking him to visit Bodley and Garner's new church, St. Michael's in Camden Town. And here is that church. Comper recalled years later how the all-white nave of so singular a beauty meant that he realized his calling to be a church architect on the spot, and couldn't rest until he was eventually articled to Bodley a few years later, thanks to another introduction by Congreve. However, there was an issue in the sense that Comper's father expected him to take holy orders. His sister, Comper's sister Mary Ellen, who did herself take religious orders at St. Margaret's Convent in Aberdeen, remembered how difficult it was for Comper to actually make this admission to his father. He managed to pluck up the courage on a walk by the River Dee in Braemar, and despite his father's initial reaction, which was obviously one of bitter disappointment, he actually, in the end, allowed his son to go and train to be an architect. The first step was obviously to go to a drawing school, and Comper, the young Comper, hoped that he might go to London to the Slade School, but his father had other ideas, because at the Slade School they allowed their students to go to life drawing classes, which John Comper disagreed with. So instead it was decided that he'd be sent to the Ruskin School in Oxford, which obviously still exists. And the curriculum there was all about copying from Ruskin's own collection of minerals and drawings and engravings and casts and statues and such like. And the other proviso too was that Comper was sent to go and stay with the Cowley Fathers once more during his education in Oxford. We see here Comper, aged 18 on the left, just as he was going into the Ruskin, and then on the right, that's Father Congreve, who's actually kneeling there at the feet of St. John the Baptist in the quite remarkable chapel, actually, of St. John's home in Cowley, which was built for the All Saints Sisters of the Poor and is now home to the Greyfriars. So when Comper arrived aged 18 in Oxford, Ruskin had actually just stopped teaching himself the term before, so he didn't actually come to be taught by the great man himself. But he was briefly swept up in a Ruskinian fervour. A couple of years earlier, he'd actually copied out every single word that Ruskin had written about Fra Angelico. And that quickly passed away, that sort of enthusiasm for Ruskin. Comper actually quite characteristically recalled his time at the Ruskin. Thusly, he wrote later on in his life, "When in the Lent term of 1882, I attended Ruskin's art school in Oxford, there remained a genuine delight in Turner's watercolours and Ruskin's own drawings, and I made some notes, hard now to believe, of appreciation of Ruskin's efforts in building the art school, and at Keble of Holman Hunt's Light of the World. But the daily sight of Magdalen Tower and my drawing of the cast of Michelangelo's Slave and some Cinquecento arabesques were all that I really learnt there, and Ruskin's influence passed away." We can see here one of his sketches from his earliest sketchbook. This is made during his time in Oxford, and it's of Merton College Chapel. It's quite accomplished, I think, actually, for an 18-year-old. But I think despite Comper actually claiming that his time at the Ruskin was of little use or education, I do suspect that there is a certain formational element in actually being in Oxford at that time. For after all, it was still a city in the afterglow of those high aesthetic undergraduates of the 1850s, the Burne-Joneses of the world, who spent all their time in the Botanic Gardens sketching little flowers and singing old ballads on banks of primroses and lovely things like that. There's actually a funny story, which I might, if someone wants to ask me in the questions about Dr. Liddon and banks of primroses, but I digress. Comper, I think, was actually exposed to an ideal of beauty in Oxford at that time, which he never really forgot or shook off. If nothing else, he did remain a positively Ruskinian horticulturalist. His garden in Norwood and Ruskin's garden in Herne Hill must surely rank amongst two of the greatest of London's lost gardens. Now, I will end this biographical diversion by quoting at some length from a letter that Comper wrote to his parents in the March of 1882. He'd spent the entire day sketching Iffley Church from the churchyard, and he related his walk back from Iffley to Cowley, writing, "I have noticed no cloud sunsets here like you have in Aberdeenshire, only a rosy light reflected on flooded meadows. There are now buds appearing, and the willows seem to have garlands of delicate pale leaves, hardly green, thrown all over them. The Lent lilies too are out, and will soon take the place of the crocus and the snowdrop, which are sadly over, and the jasmine has tired of her gold and is now putting on green, so is the hawthorn, and likewise the shrubs. Spring will have to fight its way on or die. It has gone too far out to retreat. You cannot think how lovely it all looks as you get your chin over the paling on the Iffley Road and see a sheet of water shining in the sun, broken only by the stunted willows, till it gets lost altogether amongst the trees with an occasional boat or canoe that has lost the river." I think if nothing else, that affords us a glimpse of a very different Iffley Road than the one that we know today. Comper left Oxford very quickly after his time at the Ruskin and established a practice in London in partnership with William Bucknell. Tempting as it may be to go on from here and go into any more biography, I think it suffices to say that Comper set about in the early part of his career designing incredibly faithful and academic reconstructions of medieval English churches, appealing as his authority to the ornaments rubric of the prayer book as the justification for this mission. His first pamphlet, which was written, I think, in 1893, is all about how it's seemly to build exactly as they would have done in England in the medieval period because of the ornaments rubric. That's a topic for another lecture, I think. But this was what we could call succinctly unity by exclusion. So to return to Oxford, but move away from biography to actually looking at some proper buildings, we've got here two of his finest churches anywhere, actually, I think, and certainly two of the best bits of his work in Oxford. On the left is New Hinksey, and on the right is the St. John's Home in Cowley, which I mentioned earlier. We can see this theory in practice here. New Hinksey was begun in 1898 and was tragically left incomplete beyond the chancel, well, beyond the nave, rather, partly because there was an issue with funds and partly because of an interfering diocesan architect in the form of John Aldred Scott. And I think, as John Betjeman later said of St. Cyprian's Clarence Gate, another one of Comper's finest churches, and one which was prefigured in many ways by New Hinksey, Betjeman, when he saw it, famously remarked, Norfolk and Baker Street. And I think we could probably say the same about New Hinksey, Norfolk and New Hinksey. For practically all of the detail is taken from East Anglian churches in this country, obviously, but just with the slightest dash of inspiration from Germany and the Low Countries. The open screen leads through to the English altar, which you can just about make out, with its riddle posts and angels, which is in turn lit from behind by a low east window. As Comper later wrote, in reference again to St. Cyprian's, and this is one of his finest sentences, I think, ever written, "The church is a lantern, and the altar the flame within." The sentence really just sums up all that Comper's approach to church building was about. It was all focused on the altar, and every bit of other decoration within a church was supposed to lead one's eye, one's attention towards the altar where the sacrament was reserved. On the right, as I mentioned, is St. John's Home in Cowley, which was finished in 1907. It was for the All Saint Sisters of the Poor. It sort of operated as a hospital as well as a convent. And in many ways, actually prefigures Temple Moor's work here at Pusey. It was the first non-collegiate chapel to be built for a long time, and was the first to be built with a stone screen, dividing the nuns' choir from the chapel for the patients, in much the same way that Temple Moor then, 7 years later, came and designed this chapel as two separate chapels split with a stone screen. And we can actually see in these two churches alone the development of Comper's theory in those early years. Anybody who knows anything about Comper will have the year 1900 etched in their mind as the year in which Comper underwent his conversion to the idea of unity by inclusion, which we'll hear more of later. But this was the church on the left, New Hinksey, was finished just before Comper went to Rome, where he had that conversion, that theoretical conversion, I should say. And then you see on the right a church where Comper's just working out these new ideas. It's not quite as academically English. There are little bits of other influence coming in, but it still remains unity by exclusion church, I would say. I will explain these terms later. You've got the English altar, and it really proves the point, I think, Anthony Simonson's point, that any new idea or theory that Comper formed in his mind usually took about 4 or 5 years to stew, and before it had actually architectural results. But now I think let's jump forward almost 40 years from that the days of the late Victorian liturgical movement to something altogether more modern, Comper's work here at Pusey House. So the context really is everything here. The images that you see on the screen both show Grace Bucknell, Comper's wife, who in 1933, 2 years before he got the commission here, died of having suffered from cancer. And she's seen here in a sketch by Comper, and also seen here as the model for the Virgin Mary in our window at Pusey, which was also the model for the Virgin Mary in pretty much every window. And was, I think, the highest compliment you could probably pay to your wife is to make her the model for the Virgin Mary, a very model of beauty. This was Grace's death in 1933 was the first, or rather the most significant, in a series of personal and professional tragedies and disappointments that plagued Comper during the first half of the 1930s. It was a time at which he was in his 70s. Many of his old friends and early patrons were dying, and he was becoming increasingly isolated in Upper Norwood, and actually did enter a period of isolation where he was looked after almost solely by his Italian Swiss housekeeper, Anna Pasquale. We will now see perhaps the most frustrating disappointment, in my opinion. This was a commission in 1930 to replace the shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral. This came from Father Tooth, who was, of course, the last surviving martyr of the Public Worship Regulations Act, imprisoned for his liturgical approach earlier on in the century. And Comper got so far as designing this shrine to Thomas Becket, proposed that it was built, was sent to the Dean and Chapter, who quickly rejected it. And it was actually Lord Halifax, who was the founder of this house, who went into bat for Comper during chapter meetings, but sadly to no avail. I really do think it must rank as one of the great unbuilts for Comper anyway, and I dare say probably afforded Thomas Becket some more dignity than he's currently afforded by the current arrangement. Another disappointment came in 1934, just a year before Comper came to work here, and this is his proposal for a new chapel at Cuddesdon, which was also sadly rejected. You can see actually how similar in many ways it would have been to his work at Pusey House. Eric Graham, who was the principal at the time, instigated a competition to build a new small chapel for the college. And I think among the entrants were Harry Goodhart Rendell and a very young Stephen Dykes-Bauer. But Comper, naturally distrustful of competitions, refused to enter, but instead sent these drawings to his friend Eric Graham, the principal, for consideration. And they were duly sent to Edward Morph, the architect, who was in charge of judging the entries for consideration. And I think at the time it was thought that it would be, it was a winner already. It was supposedly supposed to sum up all of what Cuddesdon was about at the time. So it was a surprise, therefore, when Harry Goodhart Rendell won instead, and that project was sadly put on hold, partly because of Goodhart Rendell's conversion to Rome, but also partly because of the war. And of course, the chapel that replaced it, I suppose, is the more modern building that you can see at Cuddesdon now. Comper actually wrote at the end of this process, after his rejection at Cuddesdon, that he wrote to Eric Graham, the principal, to say that it confirmed to him that he was not welcome or appreciated by the mainstream Church of England and could probably find no work within it. Obviously, that had also been confirmed a few years earlier at Canterbury. So therefore, a year later, when he heard news of a potential commission at Pusey, his heart must have leapt, because it certainly wasn't, and probably still isn't, classified as a mainstream Church of England place. It's always been a bit of an outlier in many ways. He was finally able, with this commission, to put lots of the architectural principles which he'd been developing over the past 35 years into practice. So we can see here how it all began. The commission for Pusey House came thanks to a substantial benefaction from a lady, Edith Powell, who died a year previously in 1934. The benefaction was for £4,000. Lady Powell was the wife of Richard Douglas Powell, 1st Baronet, who you see on the right, looking rather severe. He was a physician to Victoria, Edward VII, and George V, and I think he looks rather like, if you know P.G. Wodehouse, sort of Roderick Glossop, that sort of physician. Lady Powell, whose maiden name was Wood, not to be confused with the Woods, as in Lord Halifax, was related, actually fascinatingly, through her mother's side to the Burneys, and I owe that information to Richard and Elliot, I think, who sat here, did a bit of genealogical research. The musicologist Charles Burney was her great-great-grandfather, and then there are another series of Charles Burneys after him, all archdeacons, I think, who formed the rest of her family tree. We know that she inherited a rather serious collection of art, including lots of sketches by Thomas Girton and Turner, and also that she left a fairly substantial legacy to the RNLI, which I think still helps to fund a lifeboat in Scarborough or somewhere like that. But beyond that, relatively little is known about her, and I am, alas, yet to find a photograph of her or much else about her life. But what's significant for us is this legacy that she left for, I quote, an Anglo-Catholic object. That's how she put it in her will, and that's what Frederic Hood, the then principal of the house, had to go off when he was deciding how this money should be spent. He wasted no time in setting aside the money for work on reordering the chapel. And on the left is Comper's slab with a little inlaid memorial brass with Lady Powell's coat of arms on it, with her husband's on one side, and with a stock sort of medieval phrase over it that roughly translates, I think, as "This altar was given by Edith Powell, whose soul may God look upon with favour." So speaking of Freddie Hood, the then principal of the house, he's on the left. And it's often said that he and Comper were friends, and that's how Comper got the commission. But the truth actually is rather more complicated, and actually the truth is that Hood was initially quite wary of Comper. In Hood's mind, he associated Comper with the liturgist John Wickham Legge, who'd actually sort of tussled academically with Darwell Stone, one of Hood's predecessors at the house. And the truth was really at that point that although Comper had been associated with Wickham Legge in his unity by exclusion days, the relationship was no longer quite as friendly as it was. Instead of approaching Comper, Hood wanted to approach F.C. Eden, who was an exact contemporary of Comper's and who had also trained under Bodley. The reason for this is that Hood thought that Comper couldn't keep to the budget, but F.C. Eden was more likely to have done so. And I think it would have actually been interesting to see what he would have produced. It certainly wouldn't have been anything on the scale that we see today, because he was really foremostly a stained glass artist and an architect, secondly. Didn't really develop beyond his training with Bodley architecturally. Perhaps that's controversial, but there we go. Either way, Hood was duly persuaded by two of Comper's greatest allies, who also happened to be governors of the house. One is Lord Halifax, who we've already heard a bit about, but the other is HFB Mackay, Henry Mackay, who we see on the right here. Mackay had formerly been vicar of All St Margaret Street, and before that had been one of the first priest librarians of this house. He was appointed in 1895 and stayed until 1908 when he went off to Margaret Street. He also apparently had quite a large collection of antique children's toys, which in spiritual direction sessions, rather than engaging in conversation with his directees, he'd just pull a toy off the shelf and sit there and play with it silently. I don't know, that's a technique you might use, Father. I don't know. Mackay had also, interestingly, been involved in fighting Comper's corner in the Canterbury Cathedral debacle with Lord Halifax unsuccessfully. So actually, 5 years later, rather, when this job came up, and they were finally able to convince Frederic Hood to give their friend Comper the job, they'd really sort of done their duty, I think. Mackay actually died just as the work was finished here, quite sadly, and he was prayed for at the dedication of the altar in the window. It was actually Mackay who was Comper's point of contact for the reordering project, and as such, Comper wrote to him at the beginning of April 1935, about 4 months into the project, to record his plan for the chapel. By then, he'd already formed practically the entirety of his vision for the chapel. He wrote in his letter of the east window, the altar with its light Sicilian marble mensa, the gold-burnished ciborium, or baldacchino, with rose-red hangings behind and cherubs issuing out of dolphins, and of course, the remarkable bronze, mercurially gilded frontal. In short, I think it suffices to say that it was a vision of quite remarkable splendor, in many ways actually quite in contrast to what Temple Moor had left behind. This, in turn, we're told, provoked some ire amongst the more socially minded Oxford High Churchmen at the time, who thought that this lavish reordering represented a misuse of Lady Powell's rather nebulous benefaction. But actually, in many ways, it was a much-needed project. The reordering was long overdue. The short history of this chapel is that it was finished just as the First World War was breaking out, and therefore money ran out, and Temple Moor was unable to decorate the chapel in much of the way that he hoped. He'd actually had drawings made up by Henry Victor Milner, his favourite stained glass artist, for both the east and west windows, and which are currently hanging upstairs by the linen room, if anyone can picture that. And Moore himself had actually intended for English altars with riddle posts, the sort of ones that Comper had helped popularise in the 19th century and then largely abandoned in the 20th. And Temple Moor intended those sort of altars for both this chapel and the chapel beyond. But the First World War, as I say, got in the way, and the chapter were forced to repurpose a rather ugly wooden reredos from the old chapel, which was in the terraced house which used to house Pusey House in the first 30 years of its existence. That reredos was brought into this chapel and put there as a temporary solution. We can see it in this photo here, which provides a nice side-by-side of what Comper had to deal with and what he left behind. Comper, I think, was actually essentially brought in to finish an incomplete chapel rather than to do anything new, although that's what he did. the golden baldacchino might seem like quite a stark contrast to More's more scaled back and austere architecture, certainly in this chapel. But it was really actually representing exactly the same program and scheme architecturally that More had intended for his own chapel. As we can see in this chapel, the Chapel of the Resurrection, it's much more austere, a lack of actual decoration. The roof bosses all show Old Testament prophets, with John the Baptist above the altar in this chapel. And then you go beyond the screen, and in Temple More's chapel, the vaulting becomes much more busy and decorated. The roof bosses change from being Old Testament prophets to being disciples and apostles. And it's almost as though, as I've heard it described, that you've actually pierced the veil of the temple when you go through the screen towards where the sacrament is reserved. Temple More, rather, was actually trying to express exactly what Comper eventually expressed through an increased level of decoration towards the east. This chapel is all about eastward movement. And you'll get a very, if there's anyone here who's not actually been through the screen, I recommend doing it actually from here or from round the back, because it's a really marked contrast between the two chapels, and quite a fun experience seeing it for the first time. We can see here one of Comper's drawings for the scheme. Not many of the drawings seem to exist, strangely. There seems to be a bit of a gap in the drawings, but a series do exist at the RIBA. And you can see here one of his earliest designs for the baldacchino. But more of that in a second, because there are also letters that are preserved about the project at the RIBA. And the first are actually concerned largely with expense. Comper had relied on a quite exclusive and small network of skilled craftsmen who he'd accumulated over the course of his long career. And Ernest Smith, who was a small ecclesiastical woodcarving company in Bognor Regis, regularly executed Comper's designs for carved figures. But when he wrote to request an estimate for the figures of the resurrection and angels that are on top of the baldacchino, which you can see in the drawing there, they quoted £190, which was not the sort of price he was used to from them. He wrote to Smith in 1935, declaring somewhat forthrightly, "I must ask you most seriously to consider this simply from the practical point of view, apart from the valuation one might put on such skilled carving and the time during which you have nothing to do. The days for this are over, and it's worth some sacrifice to keep the tradition of good work and the demand for it going. In short, Comper was asking for a discount." And he actually was successful in it. Smith employed a rather obscure Italian woodcarver who I'm fascinated to learn more about, called Mr. Massini. We don't know his first name, but there is, of course, a famous Italian sculptor with the same surname. But either way, he was an Italian in England carrying out woodcarving for this company, Smith, in Bognor Regis. The company actually that the war saw off, and Comper continued sending Massini enough work over the course of his career to let him set up by himself and earn a fairly frugal living. Benfield and Loxley, interestingly, did a lot of the work, a lot of the practical work, the building firm, and they'd actually been responsible for building the chapel in the first place. And, of course, Mr. Butchart of Wellingborough did the gilding and the painting. He was one of Comper's regular go-to craftsmen, and you can also see his work here. That is Wellingborough, Comper's finest church. And you can see the baldacchino there, which was actually, the structure was put up in 1914, and I think I'm right in saying that it wasn't actually properly decorated until maybe 1940, so it actually, in many ways, comes after this baldacchino at Pusey. The only other thing that I'll point out from these photos is that the text, which you might just be able to make out on the drawing in the frieze of the baldacchino, the text is from the Easter Day introit, the Resurrexiet ad hoc tegum sum, which translates as "I am risen, and behold, I am with you." That Comper originally intended to be on the frieze, as it is at Wellingborough, but in the fullness of time, the design changed, and that was demoted to the fabric superfrontal, which still hangs in front of the altar. Here is another one of those wonderful old photos of Comper's work here, and you can see the fruits of the reordering. I think rather than describe the scheme myself, I'll just defer to Comper and read his own description of the work as it appeared in the order of service for the dedication of the altar and the window. The new window follows the precedent of a free rendering of a Jesse tree, and the intention which determined the choice of the figures in the present case is twofold, viz. The dedication of the chapel in honour of the resurrection and as a memorial to Dr. Pusey. The resurrection itself is the subject of the sculpture surmounting the ciborium magnum, or baldacchino, beneath the window, and our risen Lord in majesty is the central figure in the glass. He is seated on the perfect circle of the rainbow, which can be traced through the 5 lights of the window, and his feet rest upon the mystical thrones, which are now the third order of angels. The first and second orders, the cherubim and seraphim, are represented in large openings of the tracery above. At the foot of the middle light is the figure of Jesse, and between him and Christ in majesty is the divine child in his mother's arms. And the 2 adjoining lights on each side of our Lord are Elijah on the left, seated on a branch of the tree in the front of the chariot and the horses of the fire of his Assumption, and in the right-hand light, St. John the Baptist. Beneath them are David above Isaiah on the left and Solomon above Jeremiah on the right. And in the outer lights are Ezekiel on the extreme left and Daniel on the extreme right. And above them, standing figures of the four of the fathers of the church, St. John Chrysostom, St. Augustine on the left, and St. Athanasius and St. Jerome on the right. At the bottom of the light, on the left, next to the middle light, is a small figure of Dr. Pusey kneeling at a desk, and at the bottom of the opposite light on the right is his shield of arms. The Pusey quarterings also form the theme of the decoration of the window displays, and they occur again with the arms of the University, Christchurch and Oriel, and the diocese in the middle openings of the window tracery. Got a bit more to go, but I will just actually point out, you can see the arms that he was discussing in the window displays. You see the double-headed eagle, which are preserved today. Might just be able to make them out if you're near the back. But actually, in the other lozenges, he had the red and white stripes, which are the arms of Pusey, which at some point, I've not actually found out when, were painted over. So actually, that is the one part of the scheme that's actually not as Comper left it, and I think would just be marvellous to restore. But that's, there we go. Beneath those figures is the motto of Pusey House, Deus Sanctarum Dominus, and at the apex of the window is a small group of the coronation and 2 sensing angels. The scheme of imagery is completed by the Annunciation in the bronze gilt altar frontal, the crucifix with St. Mary and St. John on the altar, and the holy dove on the ceiling of the ciborium. The last is surrounded by scrolls inscribed with the 7 gifts and within a wreath of flowers and fruits which cherubs hold. The cherubs issuing from the dolphins on the frontal and holding eggs on the capitals have their allusions to the resurrection, and the dolphin repeated on the altar ornaments is the ichthys, the Jesus fish, which spells the sacred name of Jesus Christ, the Son of God the Saviour. The embroidered inscription on the frontlet, as I just noted earlier, is Resurrexi et Anthoc Tecum Sum. I think that gives you an impression of the scheme, the theological erudition that Comper showed in actually tying all of those scenes and figures together is quite remarkable. Now, to move on to influences, having heard about what Comper actually built in the chapel, I thought it would be interesting and instructive to look at a few small examples of figures within the work here at Pusey. Now, it's an underappreciated fact that Comper quite literally had a historical precedent for every single figure, practically every single figure or image within his work. It can all be traced back to existing artwork. Comper, just like his tutor Bodley before him, had extensive image files categorized by country and style, painstakingly catalogued and indexed. These were perhaps the most crucial tool in his process of design, and he referenced these files in his drawings using code. So, for example, he might put li.2.51, which would translate as the 51st image in the second file of his late Italian pictures. It's quite a ingenious and at times complicated system. I could spend hours now going on and going through every last detail in the chapel, tracing it back to its historical precedent through those image files. But for the sake of brevity, I'll choose just a few representative examples to show that nothing here really is without historic precedent. So I'll start with some of the larger scale and less literal sources of inspiration. This is the sarcophagus of Constantina, the daughter of the Emperor Constantine, on the left, obviously. An early Christian sarcophagus which depicts cupids gathering grapes, and Comper had actually visited the Vatican museums where this sarcophagus is kept and saw it, and then very soon after began designing bronze gilded frontals like the one at Pusey, which I think in many ways actually imitate the shape of those elegant serpentine vine scrolls in the sarcophagus, but using things like dolphins and wreaths here. This, some of you might recognize as being in this country. It's the baldacchino or ciborium in Henry VII's chapel at Westminster Abbey. And of course, over the altar is the baldacchino. There'd actually been several attempts at building baldacchinos in the 19th century. Pearson had built one at Peterborough Cathedral, quite famously. And Comper was not the first to propose it as the ideal form for an altar, but he was surely, I think, the individual who perfected and propagated this form of altar in this country. Interestingly, actually, Edmund Bishop, who was a leading Roman Catholic liturgist at the time, had written in 1905 in praise of baldacchinos, and Comper was really building on top of his and others' work, particularly with regard to drawing inspiration from 4th century church buildings. Comper wrote later that his baldacchino at Pusey, he wrote that the ciborium and altar at Pusey House is the most finished of the types which preceded it and had for their precedent Torrigiani's ciborium in Henry VII's chapel at Westminster Abbey, which is what you see on the left here. What you see on the left is a recreation by Walter Tapper, who actually entered the competition to build this place. And Comper, quite rightly, I think, identified that it was far too squat and short, and that Tapper had actually taken as his urtext this 18th century engraving, which is not accurate in its scale, I don't think. But it's easy to see when you've added a bit of height and perhaps scale back some of the decoration, how you end up with the baldacchinos that Comper was designing, including the one here, especially with those angels and arms on top of it. Moving on swiftly from Westminster to Serbia. This is part of a 14th century fresco at the Zicha monastery in Zicha. Comper actually visited the Balkans in 1925, and I think must have seen this particular image, and very quickly you see this idea appearing on testers and canopies thereafter, as at Pusey. You can see the similarities, but actually here, Comper takes the basic idea and embellishes it. I think, as I said earlier, the gifts of the Holy Spirit emanate from the dove itself, and the whole image is encircled in a wreath of fragrant fruits and flowers, which, of course, Comper, as a great horticulturalist, meticulously labeled in the drawings. As the precedent for the wreath, Comper looked to a tiny detail in an Italian manuscript from the British Library, a manuscript of the legend and life of Francis of Assisi. And the cherubs themselves are all individually taken from all sorts of different Italian pictures, practically all from Botticelli. We see here the drawing, and you can get a hint of the code at the top. I won't risk actually blinding myself, but it's just above the angel there, the cherub there. It says LI.92, which is the code I mentioned earlier. And that relates to a cutting. That's actually Comper's own cutting of an angel from which he copied. A few more. This is the Annunciation on the altar frontal, which is actually an interesting example of how Comper worked sometimes. He wouldn't often copy a picture or image precisely. He'd actually looked at a whole range of sources for different details. You can see here that the Virgin's taken from Fra Angelico on the right, but even the smallest detail, the little lily pot, is taken from a 15th century bit of Della Robbia, a really fascinating sort of combination of different forms. The Resurrection we must mention, which is taken from a rather obscure picture by Giovanni Bazzi, and even the rug is taken from a famous Iranian carpet, the Emperor's carpet. All this serves, I hope, to actually just illustrate the broad range of sources that Comper looked to for inspiration, and not, I trust, to give an impression that Comper was engaged in pastichery or being a copyist for being a copyist's sake. This actually couldn't be further from the truth. Comper himself explained his precedent-based approach to design in 1900 when the monks at Downside challenged his unusual depictions of figures in the stained glass there. Historical precedent provided authority but did not actually require slavish reproduction. Comper wrote, rather beautifully, that his aim was never to make a museum of antiquities or to copy for the sake of copying, but rather to be like the merchantman of the parable, taking from his treasures things old as well as new. Old if what is old will serve best his end, new if he cannot find what he requires in the storehouse of the past. Now the question still remains of how Comper developed from painstakingly recreating medieval churches to designing in such a way that combined hundreds, if not thousands, of national styles from across a whole span of history. And the answer is simply that Comper converted away from what he called unity by exclusion to unity by inclusion, which in the few moments I have left, I'll try and explain as simply as possible. The context is that in 1900, Comper reluctantly travelled to Rome with his aging father who wanted to see the Eternal City one final time before he died. It was quite an unattractive destination for a committed English medievalist like Comper, and he was naturally quite unimpressed by the Baroque churches that he saw there. But on the final day, just as he was about to leave, he underwent a conversion in the National Museum. It wasn't a conversion that might be expected in Rome. He'd actually tried that as a young man and was talked down by Congreve quite quickly. But the conversion was actually a stylistic one. He discovered in the National Museum figure sculptures which, he wrote, had the same forms of folds in the draperies of the statues and identical lines of decoration as he'd seen in East Anglia. This made him realize in turn that all art was connected across the national and historic divides by the same divine inspiration. Actually, 3 years before he came to work at Pusey, Comper had written down his thoughts in a pamphlet called Further Thoughts on the Christian Altar, which described his realization in rather dramatic terms, which I'll now quote. It was a lesson that he learned in Rome, like that of the vision of St. Peter on the house-top at Joppa. What God hath cleansed, that call not thou common. All beauty inspired by the Creator Spirit is one, as all goodness is one and all truth is one. It is this which Dante and the spirit of the Renaissance and the schoolmen must have seen when they claimed Greece for Christ. We see here one of Comper's examples of copying from a wider range of national styles, which we'll get onto in a minute. But from that point onwards, from 1900 onwards, Comper suddenly opened up a huge, untapped treasury of inspiration, and actually in his tours opened up to a much larger geographical range. In Cefalù, Comper discovered Christ Pantocrator in the mosaics there, and from that point onwards incorporated it into almost all of his work, actually. Certainly almost all of his major work at Pusey. It inspires the central image in the east window. Then 25 years after his trip to Rome, he encountered the ruins of the ancient basilica in modern-day Tebessa in Algeria, which led to yet further developments in his approach to planning churches, including forward altars based on 4th century basilican models. They're just two representative developments, which I mentioned very quickly, of hundreds that Comper actually underwent, largely thanks to these international tours. For Comper, devotional art truly represented divine beauty and indeed the image of God. He therefore sought to represent this fact in his own work in the most beautiful way that he possibly could. And it's for this reason that his depictions of Christ are always of a beardless, blonde youth just as he is here in Pusey, there, and of course in the resurrection statue on top of the baldacchino. Comper actually wrote of this decision to represent Christ as such that it is if he wanted to depict him as if in that moment of youth in his life on earth, which would seem to be the least inadequate figure of him who makes all things new, and is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He was not somebody who wanted to show Christ as a weak or old man. So after this conversion, the draw of Europe became almost irresistible to Comper. Not only was there endless sources of artistic inspiration from which he could draw there, but there was also a sense of popular devotion which appealed to Comper, who was no mere aesthete, but actually was a very devout Anglo-Catholic. Comper sought to encourage this sense of devotion through his own churches. To put it simply, he wanted a church designed by him to bring one to one's knees, and in the words of the doyen of Fécamp, to pray of itself. I think we should give Comper the final word in a passage which was published in the All Saints Margaret Street parish paper in 1918, which I think sums up exactly what Comper was attempting to do and achieve in his work at Pusey and beyond. He wrote, "What wins the heart abroad is the silent prayer in the churches and the bending of the knee in the street as the priest takes communion to the sick. It is not the benediction service and ceremonial procession. The English laity do not want these, but he wants assurance of the church's belief in the supernatural and the presence of her Lord, which it finds abroad in communions made on a weekday at 4 o'clock in the morning, at earliest daybreak, and in the sight of men and women, and at the sight of men and women kneeling in a church very early and very late in so great a silence that you might hear a pin drop, and in the crowds that make a thoroughfare of it in the bustle and toil of the day, and find even a moment for prayer." It's exactly what Comper was trying to encourage in his churches. And I think he would actually be very pleased to see the way in which his work here encourages that same sense of devotion today at Pusey House. Thank you.
That's well done. Thank you very much, Harry, for a wonderful talk. We now have about 25 minutes for questions. We have some microphones, and Daniel will be helping out with that. So if you're selected, just wait for the microphone to come to you before asking. And as you all contemplate your questions, may I just ask you to reflect on the thought that brevity really is the soul of wit. So, questions. Let there be questions. George.
This is just a question of clarification. Thank you so much for so wonderfully putting this before us and for all the wonderful quotations, really quite splendid. Could you say again why he chose the youthful images and the youthful face, and if you are moved to say something about whether or not he specifically was meaning to model the Cefalù Pantocrator, I'd love to hear it.
Oh, there it is. I mean, to put it most simply, Comper was actually just trying to depict the image of God in the form of his son as one who is youthful and strong, and not the usual depiction that you see in a lot of Victorian work and beyond of a sort of old, decrepit, bearded man. As I just read out, you know, he wanted him to look as though he was at the height of his sort of worldly physical power. He actually, the Pantocrator at Cefalù is an interesting example of Comper not actually copying directly from a source, but having seen an idea, and it's actually, you probably know it, Father, but the way it's displayed, it's just in this little alcove above the altar, a huge figure. God, goodness knows how much larger it is than a real figure, but it was just this idea of placing Christ in judgment above in such a prominent position that Comper liked, and he did that in various ways. We see it here in some form in the glass, but quite often he'd have a Pantocrator, you know, as a sort of metal roundel. There's an example of that at Rochdale and elsewhere. So, as I say, he wasn't copying directly from the source, but he was inspired by what he saw there.
World. Yes.
You're right, and you see it when you actually zoom in. Yeah, fascinating.
Just following up on that, could you comment a bit on the significance of the hand gestures? I mean, that's a very big theme in Buddhist art, of course, but it's interesting. The Pusey image, I think, is definitely a blessing, but I can't quite make out what the Cefalu one is.
That's a fascinating point, actually, because it's
two natures, the Holy Trinity.
But I think it is curious the way the fingers are bent in the Cefalu example. Whether that's just stylistic or not, I don't know. But as you say, I think essentially it is in blessing, and that's one of the things. Hand positions are actually one of the things that Comper referred back to his picture files most for. He was always keen to get the position of hands just right, so it was often the thing that was drawn from a different source, just the way that a hand was giving a blessing or sort of in prayer or whatever.
We have a question at the back.
Harry, you mentioned in passing the glass at Downside Abbey. Is that the only piece of Roman Catholic work that...
It's not, actually. There's... Comper did a lot of work for Downside, and actually sought permission to do so from his father and Lord Halifax, who sort of telegrammed him to say, go, do it. But interestingly, he didn't really build up that practice amongst Roman Catholic churches. There is a window, and I'll have to be forgiven because I can't remember the exact name of the church, but there's a window that's recently been rediscovered, which didn't make it into the Gazetteer in Simonson's book, The Gazetteer by Stephen Bucknell, which is a fantastic resource. It didn't make it into there, and was recently rediscovered by, I think, a church warden at that church, and has made the news. I really wish I could remember the name of the church now. But it's well worth looking up, because I think the Church Times or someone recently published on it. It's tablet, that's right. But I found an interesting design for a Roman Catholic church in Dulwich by Comper, which is it's a pure classical church with a baldacchino in the middle of the church as a forward altar, and the baldacchino actually modelled directly off the one at St. Peter's. With those little sort of hanging down leather, I don't really know what the term would be for them, sort of almost like a pelmet. So there are projected works for Roman Catholics, but not many actually saw completion.
Thank you.
Andrew?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Oh, sorry. I think for the sake of the listeners at home.
Yes.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you.
So my question, I'd like to pursue the principles question, because, yes, so he wants to represent Christ's Pantocrator, youthful, height of his powers, but two things. One, did he think that razors existed in the first century? Did they exist? I don't know.
Razors.
Razors.
Races or razors?
Razors.
Razors. Okay.
Such as I don't use. And there's a puzzle then about why he's being what to our ears would seem to be anachronistic in pressing this image of Christ, dehistoricized, and one might even want to say disincarnate. I mean, docetically represented, only seeming to be human rather than being human, and therefore not using a razor. So that's the first comment. Does this actually dehumanize Christ and take him out of his historical context? Second, it strikes me, I'm no art historian of any kind whatsoever, but it strikes me that there's a further puzzle, which is that I think when wisdom is being represented, judges, for example, still will wear a white wig. They don't wear a youthful wig. So sagacity is represented by age. Third observation, the Pantocrator, he's not represented as being grey.
Well, I think in short, you're right to say that Comper wasn't in the business of representing Christ historically. There are, I should say, actually a few examples from earlier on in the career where you do see Christ with a beard. It wasn't sort of a particularly dogmatic decision not to portray Christ with facial hair. But I think it genuinely does speak to this idea that in representing an image of Christ, Comper was actually trying to show physical power. I think that's what it is. It's all about, and he went into great efforts in sourcing the right model, right sort of models for that. And I suppose one also, I think to sort of come back slightly, I think a lot of depictions of Christ. No, not at all. But I think a lot of depictions of Christ actually don't show a man who looks 30, 33, or I think actually Comper probably realised that it had maybe gone too far, and he wanted to show Christ actually looking like somebody who might be 33. But to talk about it theoretically, I would just have to return to that quote and say that what Comper was trying to do was to show Christ who at that point of his earthly life, and he doesn't say at the point of the crucifixion or at the point of the resurrection, just at that point of his earthly life where he is at the height of his physical powers.
I've noticed quite a lot of windows which turn out to be, if I can put it this way, Comper light. The same beardless Christ or saint of very varying qualities. I wondered, did he have a lot of pupils, or were the people just emulating his style and filling country churches with cheaper variations on the Comper genius?
I think to put it concisely, the answer is the former rather than the latter. He did have a series of pupils who went on to create, I think in some cases you could maybe describe it as Comper-like, but actually some very good work. I'm thinking of people like Randall Blacking and Geoffrey Webb, who Geoffrey Webb is probably, if you've seen a window that looks like Comper but isn't by Comper, is probably the artist. There's a wonderful church not so far from here, Great Hazley, where Webb was engaged and in reordering a lot of the chancel in a little chapel. And he put in a very sort of Comperian Jesse tree window in one of the aisles, which you look at from a distance and think, oh, it's Comper because it has the same sort of colours, the same sort of blues. But when you get up closer, you do see that the sort of way he depicts faces and figures is just not quite Comper. But yeah, I think in short, you're probably, when you're seeing Comper light, are seeing Comper students.
Question here?
Thank you. Nothing on beards, I'm afraid. Speaking to the principle of unity by inclusion, this is only a decade or so away from Lutyens beavering away in Delhi and things. Did Comper take any inspiration from, say, the world outside Europe?
Well, Comper did actually design a church in India, in Pune, the mission church, a church for the Cowley Fathers. And there's work all over the world by Comper. Actually, if you go to the back of, which I might just do now, the back of the Gazetteer, there's a rest of the world section outside of the United Kingdom. So you've got there Australia, Canada, Ireland, France, India, as I say, Pune. And Dorna is another fantastic church by Comper abroad. So yeah, Comper was actually engaged in that sort of remarkable early 20th century ambition to build in the colonies as well.
A piece of Mughal architecture and work it into anything?
Well, it's just, actually, if you look at the church I mentioned in India, from the exterior, it's very much me or somebody else. It could be a sort of. It's not, in short, what Comper would build in England. And inside, you've got, inspired by 4th century basilicas from Algeria, you've got a fountain in the middle of the church to help with the climate. So he did change the way in which he was designing when he was designing abroad. Yeah.
The question by Richard.
Thank you, Harry, for a wonderful lecture. Obviously, Comper is not merely regarded as an excellent architect, but also as a vestment designer and a sort of fabrics person, as it were. Could you speak a little bit about Comper's influence in terms of the vestments and the fabrics that we used at Pusey House?
Absolutely. That I was hoping someone would ask that, actually. We had, as part of Comper's work here, he designed a full set of vestments. He designed a series of altar frontals as well. The thing that really took the time was a big cloth of gold cope, which he designed. And of course, famously, the first use of one of his patterns, Comper Strawberry, as it's now called, was for this chapel here. We actually have the original altar frontal, which is now sadly in quite a bad state of repair, in a drawer. But you can actually see the difference in quality of colour between that and what's produced today. It's much more richer gold and blue. The vestments that we use today in the chapel are reproductions of Comper's original vestments, which I believe were in a bad state of repair in the early 2000s and were swapped out for these new sets. The only significant difference is that the chasubles are in a Roman cut, a fiddleback sort of shape, whereas the chasubles that Comper designed for the chapel were in a full Gothic shape. Comper, I think, with one or two exceptions, would only design full Gothic chasubles. And the other thing that I will note quickly is, of course, there's the famous Comper pink here. Again, a more modern reproduction, but in his Van der Weyden pattern, which is taken from a painting by Van der Weyden. That the Comper pink is, the sort of stuff of legend. He'd send out a red block of damask or silk or whatever to Spain and have them leave it out in the sun for just long enough to turn it to a perfect shade of pink. And I think that's what the hanging behind the altar of sort of rose red. And the ones in the sedilia here, that's what that's sort of trying to represent.
You, please.
Could you tell us a bit more about Comper's departure from die-hard medievalism, and if that is evident in his sketchbooks? So how did he use his sketchbooks specifically?
Well, it's a really interesting point, actually. Having recently looked at a lot of the sketchbooks, you do notice a difference in what captures his attention. There's a sketchbook, which I should say there's an exhibition which Mehmet's very kindly helped put on, and which the descendants very kindly loaned pictures to. There's a sketchbook which Pusey House owned, which dates from, I think, about around 1920. After Comper's conversion to unity by inclusion, but he's still going around medieval English churches and noting down sort of vaulting patterns and stuff. He never really left it behind. I think that interest in creating perfect medieval churches was still very much a part of his practice. But of course, as I say, the geographical range of his tours after 1900 became so much more broader, so that he was actually just visiting places and seeing things that he wouldn't have seen before that point. So you do see a change in what he's drawing and what he's noting down as well. There was something else I was going to say, which has now escaped my mind.
Medievalism, when he...
It was medievalism. Oh, well, the departure happened. It was quite interesting, actually. I think in many ways he got bored of the liturgists, the sort of liturgical movement enthusiasts. Wickham Legge was one who I mentioned, but there are also people like Francis Eales, who he corresponded with for a while, who I think dedicated their lives to pamphleting and writing incredibly detailed letters about incredibly minute points of detail, very important, but I think Comper sort of outgrew that movement and was actually very dismissive of in many ways, of Percy Dearmer, who was in many ways a sort of head of that movement and was involved in the house here. The establishment of the Warham Guild and that sort of thing, Comper found distasteful, I think, and found it sort of, architecture or church decoration for a mass market. So yeah, I think that he sort of fell out of love with it at just the right time.
Just going back to the discussion of the youthful figure of Christ, firstly, was this the way he normally depicted Christ in his designs? But secondly, an observation, I mean, the earliest images of Christ from the catacombs in Rome are all basically of a young man. And so I wonder whether there's any evidence from the documents of unity by inclusion, including some reference to those catacomb representations.
Off the top of my head, I don't know, but I'm sure. But the interesting thing is that Comper was still designing these youthful Christs before he'd ever been to Rome. The earlier examples do have more sort of faintly bearded depictions of Christ. I say faintly bearded, you can just hardly make out. It's very sort of fine hair, which you can just hardly make out. But it does predate unity by inclusion. I think it was just very much part of his practice. But that's very interesting what you say about the depictions in Rome. I'll have to look that up, keep an eye out for it.
There's one question here. Thank you.
Yes, mindful here. I'm a Roman Catholic surrounded by Anglo-Catholicism at the moment. I am quite friendly. You mentioned Catholicism earlier and Comper. Yes, we have recently, my wife did the footwork, discovered Comper's stained glass window in St. Mary's Gosport. Which we thought, I thought I'd make a plug for Gosport. You're very welcome to come and take a look, anyone here. No one's got, it was considered lost, wasn't it, during the bombing in 1941, and all record was lost. We didn't know what church it was, we've got more than one St. Mary's, but my wife actually finally nailed it down, and we have a Catholic Comper in Gosport High Street which somehow survived the severe bombing that we had. So by miracle, it survived.
Thank you for reminding me which church it was. And it's quite an interesting window, isn't it? It's from memory, is it a war memorial window? That's First World War memorial window? Am I wrong?
It's a Jesuit tree window.
Jesuit tree, okay.
Yeah, Jesuit tree window. And I had the privilege with my husband to see the actual drawings of Ninian Comper with his scribbles, and to confirm that it was Gosport, he has written Gosport on all the 5 existing drawings. There were 3 missing drawings, but we managed to view 5 drawings.
Well, I hope you got photos.
Yes. Yeah, we took photos only for personal use,
of course.
and we have to order.
But I'd be interested to, well, maybe next time I'm at the RIBA, I'll search up those drawings, because no doubt there'll be code all over it which you can trace back. As I was tracing back here, but well done. I think that's you've done a very good job in bringing Comper to a wider audience with all that press coverage and things. Brilliant.
I think we are out of time, unfortunately, but please join me in thanking our speaker, Harry Spain. Thank you.
Thank you.